My name is Sarah, and at 34 years old, I never imagined that a simple dinner party would unravel 12 years of marriage and expose the man I thought I knew completely. Tom and I had built what seemed like the perfect life in our Connecticut suburb, hosting weekly gatherings that our friends always looked forward to. But that night, when my husband made his joke about wife trading while our guests laughed nervously around our dining table, something shifted in our neighbor Gary's eyes that made my blood run cold. Before I continue this shocking story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit like and subscribe if you've ever discovered something disturbing about someone you trusted completely. Looking back now, I realize the signs were always there, hiding behind Tom's charming smile and his gift for making everyone feel special. We lived in a beautiful colonial home in Westport, Connecticut, the kind of place where manicured lawns and luxury SUVs created an illusion of perfection that we all worked hard to maintain. I was a marketing director at a Fortune 500 company, and Tom was a financial advisor whose client list read like a who's who of Connecticut's elite. Together, we were the couple everyone envied, or at least that's what Tom constantly reminded me. Our weekly dinner parties had become something of a tradition in our neighborhood. Every Saturday evening, our dining room would fill with the comfortable chatter of couples we'd known for years, sharing wine and stories while pretending our lives were as flawless as they appeared on social media. Tom lived for these gatherings. He needed them the way some people need coffee in the morning. The attention, the admiration, the way people hung on his every word when he told his stories about closing big deals or his latest golf game triumph. I used to find it endearing, this boyish need for validation. I told myself it was just his personality, that some people were simply more social than others. But something had changed in recent months, especially after Gary and Monica moved into the neighborhood. Gary was everything Tom wanted to be. He was 41, had sold his first tech company for 8 figures, and was already building his second. He drove a Porsche, flew private to meetings in Silicon Valley, and had the kind of casual confidence that comes from never having to check your bank balance. From the moment they met at the country club, Tom became obsessed with impressing him. Monica was different from the typical Westport wife. She was quiet, almost withdrawn, with dark eyes that seemed to carry secrets she'd never share. While other wives chatted about their children's private school achievements or their latest renovations, Monica would sit silently nursing a single glass of wine throughout an entire evening. I tried to befriend her, but she always kept me at arm's length, offering polite smiles that never quite reached her eyes. The other regulars at our dinners were Steve and Jennifer, friends we'd known since our wedding. Steve worked with Tom at the firm, a steady, reliable guy who laughed too loudly at Tom's jokes and always brought the same bottle of overpriced wine. Jennifer was my closest friend in the neighborhood, a former teacher who'd given up her career to raise their 3 kids. She had a radar for gossip and an opinion about everything, but her heart was always in the right place. In the weeks leading up to that fateful dinner party, Tom's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He'd make comments about other couples that made me uncomfortable. Things like how European marriages were more evolved, or how monogamy was a social construct invented by religious zealots. When I'd challenge him, he'd laugh it off, saying I needed to loosen up, that I was becoming too conservative in my 30s. He'd point out other wives at the club, commenting on their figures, their style, always with a comparison that left me feeling inadequate. The preparation for that particular dinner party felt different from the start. Tom was nervous in a way I'd never seen before, checking his phone constantly, adjusting and readjusting the place settings. He insisted I make his mother's beef Wellington, even though it took hours and Gary had mentioned being mostly vegetarian. Everything had to be perfect, he kept saying. This was important for his career, for our future. I spent the entire day cooking, creating an elaborate spread that would have impressed Julia Child herself. Bacon-wrapped scallops, truffle mac and cheese, roasted vegetables with herbs from our garden, and that complicated beef Wellington that required more steps than a ballet routine. Tom barely helped, spending most of the day on calls with Gary, laughing at inside jokes I didn't understand. As I arranged flowers in the crystal vase we'd received as a wedding gift, I noticed Tom had set out his most expensive scotch, the bottle he'd been saving for a special occasion. When I asked what we were celebrating, He just smiled and said it was time we elevated our social circle. The comment stung as if Steve and Jennifer, our friends for over a decade, were suddenly not good enough. That evening I squeezed into the black dress Tom had laid out for me, the one he said made me look sophisticated. It was tighter than I preferred, shorter than I was comfortable with, but arguing would have led to another lecture about how I needed to make more effort, how Gary's wife always looked impeccable. I did my makeup carefully, trying to hide the exhaustion from cooking all day, and put on the diamond earrings Tom had given me for our anniversary, back when his gifts came from love rather than obligation. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock. Tom practically sprinted to answer it, his eagerness embarrassing in its transparency. Gary and Monica stood at our doorstep like mismatched bookends. Gary wore designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's mortgage payments, while Monica was draped in a simple black dress that hung loosely on her thin frame. Gary handed Tom a bottle of wine that I recognized from the exclusive wine shop downtown, the one where bottles started at $300. Steve and Jennifer arrived minutes later, Jennifer immediately pulling me aside to whisper that she'd driven by earlier and seen Gary's Porsche already in our driveway for over an hour. The information sent a small chill down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. Tom had said he was setting up, but what kind of setup required an hour-long preview with what one guest? The evening started normally enough. We gathered in the living room for cocktails, Tom playing bartender with theatrical flair, mixing martinis and old fashions, while regaling everyone with a story about a client who'd tried to pay him in cryptocurrency. Steve laughed too hard at the punchline. Jennifer rolled her eyes, and Gary sat back with an amused smirk that suggested he found Tom's performance entertaining rather than impressive. Monica positioned herself in the corner of our cream-colored sofa, clutching her wine glass like a shield. When Jennifer tried to engage her in conversation about the local school district, she responded in monosyllables, her gaze constantly drifting to Gary, as if seeking permission to speak. I noticed bruises on her upper arm, faint purple marks that looked suspiciously like fingerprints. But when I caught her eye, she quickly adjusted her shawl to cover them. By the time we moved to the dining room, Tom had already finished 3 scotches. His voice had grown louder, his gestures more animated, and his jokes were taking on an edge that made everyone uncomfortable. He started with relatively harmless observations about marriage, comparing it to a business merger where both parties had to bring equal value to the table. Steve nodded along, earning a sharp elbow from Jennifer. As I served the main course, Tom launched into a story about a colleague whose wife had gained weight after having children. The room fell silent except for the clink of silverware against china. Jennifer's face flushed red, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach where she still carried baby weight from her youngest, now 3 years old. I tried to change the subject, asking Gary about his new company, but Tom steamrolled over me. "Marriage is like a lease agreement," he announced, refilling his glass with an unsteady hand. "You sign up for certain terms and conditions, but sometimes you want to upgrade to a newer model." The joke landed with a thud. Steve forced out a nervous chuckle. Jennifer stared at her plate, and Monica seemed to shrink further into her chair. But Gary leaned forward, his eyes glittering with interest. Tom took Gary's attention as encouragement and doubled down. "You know what they do in Europe?" He continued, his words beginning to slur. "They're more evolved about these things. They understand that variety is the spice of life. Wife swapping is practically a national pastime in some countries. Keeps marriages fresh, prevents divorce." The silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer's fork clattered onto her plate. Steve's mouth hung open like a caught fish. Monica's knuckles were white around her wineglass. I felt my face burning with humiliation and rage, my hands trembling as I gripped the serving spoon. But it was Gary's reaction that sent ice through my veins. While everyone else sat in shocked discomfort, he was smiling a slow, calculating smile that reminded me of a predator spotting prey. "Are you serious?" Gary asked, his voice casual, but his eyes intense. "Because I know people who would be very interested in that kind of arrangement." Tom, who had clearly expected laughter, or maybe mild scandal, suddenly looked uncertain. He glanced at me, perhaps seeing my horror for the first time, then back at Gary. "I was just joking," Tom said. but his voice lacked conviction. Gary shrugged, swirling his wine. "Shame," he said. "I thought you were finally ready to think outside the box." Monica made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper, then excused herself to the bathroom. I couldn't stay in that room another second. I escaped to the kitchen under the pretense of getting dessert, gripping the counter to stop my hands from shaking. The man I'd married, the father of the children we'd been trying to have had, just offered me up like a commodity to be traded. Even as a joke, the words revealed something dark and disturbing about how he saw me, how he saw our marriage. Monica appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, glancing back toward the dining room. "Gary has issues. He gets these ideas, and he doesn't understand boundaries. You need to be careful." Before I could ask what she meant, we heard Tom's booming laugh from the dining room, followed by Gary's lower chuckle. When I returned with a hastily assembled dessert tray, Tom and Gary were huddled at one end of the table, speaking in low voices, while Steve and Jennifer sat in uncomfortable silence. Gary looked up at me with that same predatory smile, his gaze traveling over my body in a way that made my skin crawl. Tom didn't even notice, too busy hanging on Gary's every word. The party ended within the hour. Jennifer claimed their babysitter needed to leave early, though I knew their teenager was watching the younger kids. Steve couldn't get out fast enough, barely making eye contact with anyone. Gary lingered, trying to corner Tom for one more private conversation, but Monica practically dragged him to the door, apologizing repeatedly for having to leave. After everyone left, the house felt contaminated. Dirty dishes covered every surface, but I couldn't bring myself to clean them. Tom was in the living room, pouring himself another scotch and humming like he'd just closed the deal of the century. When I confronted him about his inappropriate comments, he barely looked up from his phone. "It was just a joke, babe," he said, already texting someone. "Everyone knew I was kidding. You really need to lighten up. You're becoming such a prude lately. No wonder people think you're boring." The words hit like physical blows. This was the man who'd promised to cherish me, to honor me, who'd stood before our families and God, and vowed to be faithful. Now he was calling me boring because I wouldn't laugh at being offered up for trade. The next morning I woke to find Tom already gone, unusual for a Sunday. His phone was on the nightstand, and a text notification from Gary lit up the screen. Just the preview was enough to make my stomach turn. "We need to talk about last night. I think we're on the same wavelength. My wife needs convincing, but yours seems." The message cut off there, but I didn't need to read more to know something terrible was brewing. When Tom returned home that afternoon, he was different. Energized in a way I hadn't seen in years, talking about new opportunities and expanding horizons. He mentioned that Gary wanted to discuss a potential investment opportunity, something that could set us up for life. When I pressed for details, he became evasive, saying it was complicated financial stuff I wouldn't understand. The condescension in his voice made me want to scream. I had an MBA, ran million-dollar marketing campaigns, but suddenly I couldn't understand his business dealings. Over the next few weeks, Tom's behavior became increasingly secretive. His phone was never out of his hand, and he'd step outside to take calls, claiming they were about sensitive client information. He started going to the gym at odd hours, buying new clothes, expensive cologne. When I'd question these changes, he'd turn it around on me, saying I was becoming paranoid, that maybe I needed therapy for my trust issues. The first time Gary showed up when Tom wasn't home, I was gardening in the backyard. He appeared at the gate like he'd been watching, waiting for Tom's car to leave. He made small talk about property values and landscaping tips, but his eyes kept wandering over me in a way that made me want to cover myself despite being fully dressed in jeans and a sweater. Then he said something that made my blood freeze. "Tom tells me you're unhappy," he said, moving closer. "Says you two haven't been intimate in months. Maybe you just need some excitement in your life. Someone who knows how to appreciate what you have to offer." I told him to leave immediately, threatening to call the police if he ever came to my home uninvited again. He laughed, actually laughed, and said Tom had given him permission to stop by any time. "We're becoming very close friends," he added with a wink that made me nauseous. That evening I confronted Tom about Gary's visit. He brushed off my concerns, saying Gary was just being friendly, that I was misinterpreting everything because of my uptight mindset. He actually defended Gary, saying successful men like him didn't have time for games, that if he was interested in being friends, we should be grateful. When I told him exactly what Gary had said about our intimate life, Tom's face went red, but not with anger at Gary. He was angry at me for being rude to his new friend. That night, while Tom slept, I did something I'd never done in 12 years of marriage. I went through his phone. What I found destroyed any remaining trust I had. His search history was filled with visits to adult lifestyle sites, forums about open marriages, and worse, local clubs that catered to couples looking to experiment. There were long message threads with Gary discussing things that made me physically ill. Tom had been describing our intimate life in graphic detail, sharing things that should have been sacred between husband and wife. But the worst discovery was a folder of photos, pictures of me that Tom had taken over the years. Some intimate, some just regular photos, but all sent to Gary with comments that made me feel violated in ways I couldn't even articulate. My husband had been shopping me around like a used car, advertising my features to his new friend. Tom started coming home later and later, always with elaborate excuses about client dinners or networking events. His clothes would smell of alcohol and perfume, cheap perfume, that certainly wasn't mine. When I'd confront him, he'd gaslight me, saying I was imagining things, that my jealousy was destroying our marriage. He started sleeping in the guest room, claiming my paranoia was making it impossible for him to relax in his own home. Jennifer called me one afternoon, her voice trembling with anger and concern. Steve had let something slip after too many beers. Tom and Gary had been going to a private club in the city, a place where couples went to meet other like-minded individuals. Steve had refused to go, but Tom had been pressuring him, saying it would be good for their marriages, that Jennifer would benefit from the experience. Jennifer was devastated, not just by the betrayal, but by the fact that our husbands were discussing us like property to be shared. The next time I saw Monica was at the grocery store. She looked worse than before, thinner, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. When she saw me, she tried to hurry away, but I caught up with her in the parking lot. She broke down crying, admitting that Gary had been pushing her into situations she wasn't comfortable with, that he'd been meeting couples online and bringing them to their house. She was terrified of him, but more terrified of leaving. He controlled all their finances, had convinced her that no one would believe her if she tried to get help. Tom's criticism of me intensified. Suddenly, everything about me was wrong. I didn't dress sexy enough. I'd let myself go. I was too uptight, too boring, too traditional. He'd make comments comparing me to Gary's wife, saying Monica knew how to keep her man happy, that she understood what marriage in the 21st century required. The irony of him praising Monica while she was secretly falling apart was lost on him. I started documenting everything. Screenshots of his messages, photos of receipts. I found recordings of his cruel comments. I opened my own bank account, started moving small amounts of money, preparing for what I knew was coming. But I needed concrete proof of what Tom and Gary were planning, something that would protect me when everything exploded. The night I decided to follow Tom changed everything. He told me he had a client dinner in Greenwich, an important meeting that could lead to a huge commission. He dressed casually, though, just jeans and a polo shirt, not his usual business attire. Something felt wrong, and every instinct I'd developed over 34 years was screaming at me to pay attention. I waited 15 minutes after he left, then got in my car and used the tracking app on his phone that he didn't know I'd activated. Instead of heading toward Greenwich, he drove to Gary's house. My heart was pounding as I parked down the street, watching as several other cars arrived. I recognized some of them. The Petersons from 2 streets over, the Davidsons, who ran the local country club, even the Harrises who sang in our church choir. I called Jennifer, my voice shaking as I told her where I was and what I was seeing. She didn't hesitate, saying she'd be there in 10 minutes and threatening to castrate Steve if he tried to stop her. True to her word, she pulled up beside me, her face set in grim determination. We sat there for a moment, gathering courage, then decided we couldn't wait any longer. Whatever was happening in that house, I needed to see it with my own eyes. The front door was unlocked, which should have been our first warning. We could hear voices from the living room, multiple conversations happening at once. Jennifer grabbed my hand as we walked down the hallway, both of us trembling but determined. What we found wasn't quite the scene I'd feared, but it was somehow worse. They were having a meeting. A dozen couples sat around Gary's living room, some on couches, others on chairs brought in from the dining room. There was a presentation on the TV screen, actual slides about lifestyle choices and consent agreements. Tom was standing next to Gary, pointing at something on the screen, looking more animated than I'd seen him in years. It took a moment for people to notice us standing in the doorway, but when they did, the room went completely silent. Tom's face went through several transformations: surprise, fear, anger, and finally a fake smile as he tried to play it off. "Sarah, honey, what are you doing here? This isn't what it looks like. We're just having an investment meeting." Gary stood up, that predatory smile spreading across his face. "Actually, Tom, I think it's perfect that she's here. You said she was curious but shy. Now she can see for herself what we're about." That's when I saw Monica hunched in a corner chair, looking smaller than ever. Her eyes met mine, and I saw my own fear and disgust reflected there. But also something else: relief that she wasn't alone anymore. I found my voice, and when I spoke, it was louder and steadier than I expected. "I never consented to any of this," I said, looking directly at the other couples. "My husband has been lying to everyone. I'm not interested, I've never been interested, and the fact that he's been discussing me with all of you without my knowledge is disgusting." Some of the couples looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others seemed annoyed at the interruption. Gary pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages. "Tom's been very clear about your interest," he said, his voice oily with false concern. "He's shared quite a bit about your preferences, your desires. Should I read some of these messages out loud?" The threat was clear, but I was beyond caring. "Go ahead," I said. "Read them. Let everyone here know what kind of man shares intimate details about his wife with strangers." Tom tried to intervene, moving toward me with his hands outstretched like he was approaching a wild animal. "This is a misunderstanding," he kept saying. "Gary, she doesn't understand. We talked about easing her into it, but Gary wasn't interested in Tom's damage control." He started reading the messages, each word a nail in the coffin of my marriage. Tom had shared everything: our problems, our intimate moments, my body, my supposed fantasies that were actually his projections. Monica suddenly stood up, her voice shaking but determined. "He does the same thing to me," she announced, looking at the other women in the room. "Gary tells people I want things I've never agreed to. He brings strangers to our home and tells me I'm being uptight when I object. How many of you are really here willingly? How many of you were told your husbands had discussed this with you when they hadn't?" The room erupted. Several women started talking at once, some defending their choices, others looking at their husbands with new suspicion. One couple got up and left immediately, the wife refusing to even look at her husband. Jennifer stepped forward, her teacher voice cutting through the chaos. "This is sexual coercion," she announced. "What Gary and Tom are doing could be considered criminal. Discussing someone in a sexual context without their consent. Sharing private images, planning encounters without agreement. These are serious violations." Tom's face had gone pale. He kept looking between me and Gary like he was trying to figure out who to side with. Gary, meanwhile, had shifted into damage control mode, insisting everything was consensual, that Tom had assured him I was interested but playing hard to get. The two men who'd been united in their scheme were now turning on each other, each trying to shift blame. I pulled out my phone and started recording, announcing clearly that I was documenting everything for my attorney. The reaction was immediate. People scattered like roaches when you turn on a light. Gary tried to grab my phone, but Jennifer stepped between us, all 5 feet 2 inches of her, ready to fight. Monica took the opportunity to move to our side, the three of us standing together while the room emptied. Tom tried one last manipulation. "Sarah, please let's talk about this at home. This is all a misunderstanding. I was just trying to spice things up for us. You've been so distant lately." But I was done listening to his excuses. I looked him straight in the eye and said the words I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks. I want a divorce, Tom. I have evidence of everything. The messages, the photos you shared without my consent, the plans you made involving me without my knowledge. I have it all. And if you try to fight me on this, if you try to blame me or make this difficult, I'll make sure everyone in your professional circle knows exactly what kind of man you are. His face crumbled, the reality finally hitting him. Gary tried to interject, saying something about overreactions and misunderstandings, but Monica shut him down. We're done too, Gary. And I'm taking everything. The house, the investments, everything. Because I have recordings of what you've subjected me to for the past year. The next morning, I was sitting in the office of the best divorce attorney in Connecticut. Margaret Brennan was a legend known for taking cases that involved what she delicately called marital impropriety. When I showed her the evidence I'd collected, her expression went from professional interest to genuine disgust. This is one of the most clear-cut cases of marital misconduct I've seen, she said. Your husband didn't just violate your trust, he potentially violated several laws. She explained that sharing intimate photos without consent was a crime in Connecticut. The fact that Tom had been planning to involve me in sexual situations without my knowledge or consent could be considered attempted sexual assault. The messages between him and Gary showed a clear pattern of deception and manipulation. Margaret assured me that Tom would be lucky if all he lost was money and reputation. While she began preparing the divorce papers, I went to our bank. That's when I discovered Tom had been moving money into accounts I didn't know existed. Tens of thousands of dollars had been siphoned off over the past 6 months. When I confronted the bank manager with my marriage certificate and power of attorney documents, he revealed that Tom had opened several investment accounts with Gary's company. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. Gary hadn't just been corrupting Tom socially, he'd been bleeding him financially. I called Tom's business partners that afternoon. Not to destroy him out of spite, but to protect other families from what he and Gary were planning. I kept it professional, simply stating that I had concerns about Tom's judgment and associations that could potentially impact the firm's reputation. Word spreads fast in Westport's professional circles. By evening, 3 major clients had called the firm asking about Tom's status. Tom came home to find the locks changed and his belongings in boxes on the lawn. He stood there in his expensive suit looking like a lost child. The neighbors watched from their windows as he pounded on the door, begging me to let him in. When I finally answered through the security chain, he tried every manipulation in his playbook. He cried. He apologized. He promised to change. He threatened suicide. He blamed Gary. He blamed me. He even blamed his parents for not showing him enough affection as a child. I recorded the entire interaction on my phone, especially the part where he admitted to sharing private photos of me with Gary and others. He was so desperate to get inside that he confessed to things I hadn't even discovered yet. He'd been meeting with other couples for months, had already participated in encounters that made my stomach turn. He'd been tested for STDs just the week before, terrified he'd infected me with something. The man I'd shared a bed with for 12 years had been living a complete double life. Margaret filed the divorce papers the next day, citing extreme cruelty and gross misconduct. She also sent cease and desist letters to Gary and anyone else Tom had shared my photos with, threatening criminal prosecution if the images weren't immediately destroyed. The legal language was harsh and unforgiving, making it clear that any further contact or distribution would result in immediate law enforcement involvement. Monica and I began meeting regularly, supporting each other through the nightmare our husbands had created. She revealed that Gary's control went deeper than I'd imagined. He'd isolated her from her family, convinced her she was mentally unstable, gaslit her so thoroughly that she'd begun to question her own perceptions. But she'd been secretly recording his abuse for months, building her own case with the help of a domestic violence counselor. Together, we discovered that Gary and Tom weren't the only ones. There was a whole network of men in Westport and surrounding towns who were involved in this lifestyle, many of them coercing their wives the same way. We started reaching out to other women carefully and quietly, offering support and resources. What began as 2 victims finding solidarity grew into an underground network of women protecting each other. The story leaked as stories always do in small towns. Someone at the country club overheard something a paralegal at a law firm mentioned something to a friend, and suddenly everyone knew. Tom's reputation crumbled overnight. Clients refused to work with him, his golf buddies stopped returning his calls, even the bartender at his favorite restaurant treated him with cold disdain. His own family turned against him when they learned the truth. His mother, a proper Southern woman who'd always treated me like the daughter she never had, called me sobbing with apologies. She'd raised him better than this, she said. His father, a retired military man, sent me a letter saying I would always be family to them, regardless of what their son had done. His sister posted a cryptic but pointed message on social media about men who don't deserve the women who love them. Gary's business began hemorrhaging investors once word got out. Turns out people don't want to trust their money to someone who can't be trusted with basic human decency. His company's board called an emergency meeting, and within a week, he was forced to step down from his own company. The tech world is small, and news of his behavior spread to Silicon Valley. His dreams of a second successful exit evaporated along with his reputation. Tom made one last desperate attempt to salvage something. He showed up at my office with flowers and a jewelry box, making a scene in front of my colleagues. Security had to physically remove him while he shouted about how I was ruining his life over a misunderstanding. The spectacle was the final nail in his professional coffin. His firm put him on administrative leave that afternoon, and by the end of the week, he was formally terminated for bringing disrepute to the company. 6 months later, my life looked completely different. The divorce was finalized with a settlement that left me financially secure, and Tom virtually bankrupt after legal fees and the division of assets. The house had sold quickly, and I'd used my share to buy a smaller but charming apartment in a different town where nobody knew my story. It was mine alone, decorated exactly how I wanted, with no traces of the life I'd shared with Tom. The legal consequences for Tom and Gary went beyond divorce. The district attorney's office had opened an investigation into the sharing of intimate images without consent. While criminal charges were still pending, several women had filed civil suits. Gary's wealth was being systematically dismantled by legal fees and settlements. Tom, unable to find work in finance, had moved back in with his parents in North Carolina, a 43-year-old man starting over in his childhood bedroom. Monica had also divorced Gary and was using her settlement to start a nonprofit organization helping women escape coercive relationships. She'd transformed from the quiet, broken woman I'd met into a fierce advocate for others. We remained close friends, bonded by trauma, but defined by our survival. Our organization grew quickly, providing resources, legal referrals, and safe spaces for women to share their experiences. Jennifer and Steve's marriage survived, but barely. She demanded complete transparency, access to all his devices, and couples therapy. Steve, to his credit, had cut Tom out of his life completely and had testified in my divorce proceedings about Tom's behavior. Their relationship would never be the same, but Jennifer said she was willing to rebuild if Steve proved he could be trustworthy. Time would tell if they'd make it. My career flourished once I was free from Tom's constant criticism and sabotage. The promotion I'd been passed over for twice suddenly materialized when my boss realized how much I'd been carrying both at work and at home. I threw myself into my work, finding solace in projects and success I could control. My colleagues who'd witnessed Tom's final meltdown formed a protective circle around me, making sure I knew I was valued and respected. The first time I went on a date after the divorce, I was terrified. The man was a friend of a friend, a widower who understood loss and betrayal in his own way. Over coffee, I told him an abbreviated version of my story, watching his face for signs of judgment or disinterest. Instead, he reached across the table and took my hand, saying that anyone who'd survived what I had with such grace was someone he'd be honored to know better. We took things slowly, rebuilding my ability to trust at a pace that felt safe. The women's group Monica and I had started grew into something beautiful. Every Thursday evening, we'd gather in the community center, sharing stories, offering support, and reminding each other that we deserved respect and dignity. Some women were escaping situations like ours, others were processing different types of betrayal, but all of us were learning that our worth wasn't determined by the men who'd failed to value us. I learned to recognize the red flags I'd ignored for so long. The way Tom had slowly isolated me from friends who questioned him. How he'd made me doubt my own instincts by calling me paranoid or uptight. The gradual erosion of boundaries I'd allowed because I wanted to be the cool wife, the understanding partner. His jokes that weren't really jokes, but tests to see how far he could push. The constant need for validation from others because he was empty inside. Looking back, I realized our entire marriage had been a performance for Tom. I was a prop in his show, the successful wife who made him look good. He never saw me as a person with my own thoughts, feelings, and autonomy. I was an accessory to be upgraded or traded when something shinier came along. The joke about wife trading hadn't been spontaneous. It was the culmination of years of seeing me as an object he owned. My therapist helped me understand that Tom's behavior was a form of abuse even before the obvious betrayals. The constant criticism disguised as jokes, the gaslighting when I expressed discomfort, the financial control I hadn't even realized he'd been exerting. She helped me forgive myself for not seeing it sooner, for staying as long as I did, for believing his lies about who was to blame for our problems. The news about Tom filtered back to me occasionally. He tried online dating, but couldn't maintain the facade long enough to keep anyone interested. His social media profiles, once full of boastful posts about his success and lifestyle, went silent. The last I heard, he was working at a small accounting firm doing basic bookkeeping for a fraction of his former salary. His parents had given him an ultimatum to get therapy or find somewhere else to live. Gary's fall was more public and spectacular. Monica's organization had gained media attention, and she'd given several interviews about her experience, never naming Gary directly, but providing enough details that everyone knew. His second company folded before it ever launched. His ex-investors sued him for misrepresentation. He'd relocated to Florida where nobody knew his history, but the internet never forgets. Every woman he met eventually Googled him and found the stories. I found strength in unexpected places. The prosecutor who took our case seriously and fought for justice. The judge who saw through Tom's attempts to paint me as an unreasonable prude. My boss who gave me time off during the worst of it and a raise when I came back stronger. The neighbor who'd barely spoken to me in 5 years, but left flowers on my doorstep with a note saying she'd been through something similar and was proud of me. One evening, while hosting a dinner party in my new apartment, I looked around at the faces of my true friends. Jennifer was there, laughing genuinely for the first time in months. Monica had brought her new boyfriend, a kind man who treated her with the respect she'd always deserved. My sister had flown in from Seattle, protective and proud. These were people who knew my story, my struggles, my strength, and loved me not despite it all, but because of how I'd handled it. That dinner party joke had cost Tom everything. His marriage, his career, his reputation, his family's respect, his financial security, his friends, and any chance at the future he'd imagined. But it had given me something precious. Freedom. The freedom to be myself without apology, to set boundaries without guilt, to expect respect without compromise. The freedom to know that my dignity was never negotiable, not even for love. Today, as I share this story with you, I want you to know that if you recognize yourself in my experience, if someone you love is treating you like property rather than a person, if jokes are being made at your expense that don't feel funny, you're not too sensitive. You're not overreacting. You're not a prude. You're a human being deserving of respect, dignity, and genuine love that never requires you to compromise your values or comfort. The signs are often subtle at first. A joke that goes too far, a boundary, push just a little criticism disguised as concern for your own good. But these small violations pave the way for bigger ones. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Don't wait for a dinner party disaster to recognize that the person sharing your bed doesn't actually share your values. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. That uncomfortable feeling in your stomach when your partner discusses you inappropriately. That's your intuition trying to protect you. the embarrassment when they make jokes at your expense. That's your dignity asserting itself. The anger when they dismiss your concerns. That's your self-respect fighting to survive. Listen to these feelings. They're not weaknesses. They're your strength trying to guide you to safety. To anyone watching this who's been through something similar, you're not alone. The shame you feel isn't yours to carry. It belongs to the person who betrayed your trust, who violated your boundaries, who treated you as less than human. Your story matters, your pain is valid, and your healing is possible. It won't be linear or easy, but I promise you there's life and even joy on the other side of betrayal. If you're currently in a situation like mine was, please know that help exists. There are resources, legal protections, and people who will believe and support you. Document everything, trust your instincts, and don't let anyone convince you that your boundaries are negotiable. You deserve a partner who respects you, values you, and would never dream of treating you as anything less than their equal. For those of you who are friends or family of someone in this situation, please don't dismiss their concerns or tell them they're overreacting. Sometimes a joke isn't just a joke. Sometimes it's a revelation of how someone really thinks. Support them, believe them, and help them find resources if they need them. Your validation might be the thing that gives them strength to protect themselves. The community of survivors I've found has taught me that our stories, while unique in their details, share common threads. The gradual erosion of respect, the normalization of inappropriate behavior, the gaslighting that makes us question our own perceptions. But we also share strength, resilience, and the ability to rebuild our lives on our own terms. We're not victims, we're survivors, and our experiences can help protect others. I think about Monica often, how she went from a shadow of herself to a powerful advocate for others. Her organization has helped hundreds of women recognize and escape coercive relationships. She took her pain and transformed it into purpose. That's what survival looks like, not just getting through something, but growing through it and helping others do the same. Sometimes I wonder if Tom ever truly understood what he lost. Not just me, but the life we could have had if he'd been capable of seeing me as a complete person rather than an accessory to his ego. We could have grown old together, supported each other through life's challenges, built something real and lasting. Instead, he chose the temporary thrill of Gary's approval and a fantasy that existed only in his imagination. The last time I accidentally saw Tom was at a gas station 2 towns over. He was pumping gas into an old Honda, a far cry from the BMW he used to drive. He looked older, defeated, smaller somehow. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw him start to approach. I simply shook my head, got in my car, and drove away. There was nothing left to say. He'd made his choices, and I'd made mine. To everyone watching who's wondering if they should tolerate disrespect for the sake of keeping peace or maintaining a marriage or avoiding conflict, please hear me. Peace at the cost of your dignity isn't peace, it's surrender. A marriage that requires you to accept humiliation isn't worth saving. Conflict that arises from defending your boundaries is necessary and healthy. You deserve better, and better is possible. My life now isn't perfect, but it's authentically mine. I wake up each morning in a space that feels safe, surrounded by things I chose, living by values I determine. I date when I want to set boundaries without apology and never have to worry about being offered up as entertainment for someone else's amusement. That dinner party joke might have destroyed my marriage, but it revealed a truth that ultimately set me free. I want to leave you with this thought. Your worth is inherent and non-negotiable. It doesn't depend on your relationship status, your willingness to compromise your boundaries, or your partner's opinion of you. You are complete and valuable exactly as you are. Anyone who suggests otherwise, whether through jokes or actions, is telling you they don't deserve to be in your life. Listen to them, believe them, and choose yourself. That night at the dinner party, when Tom made his joke about wife trading and Gary took him seriously, it felt like my world was ending. In a way it was. But from those ashes rose a new life, one built on truth, respect, and unshakable self-worth. Tom lost everything because he never understood that I wasn't his to trade. I was always my own person. It just took his betrayal for me to remember that truth. If this story resonated with you, if you saw yourself or someone you love in my experience, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever discovered something shocking about someone you trusted? How did you find the strength to move forward? Your stories matter and could help someone else recognize their own situation. Please like this video if it touched you, subscribe to hear more stories of survival and triumph, and share it with anyone who might need to hear that they're not alone and that there's hope on the other side of betrayal. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember you deserve respect, dignity, and love that celebrates who you are, not what someone can get from you. Stay strong, trust yourself, and never let anyone convince you that your boundaries don't matter.